And now, by kind permission of the Beatles manager Brian Epstein and Ken Brosiak of Aztec Services, who brought the group to Australia, let's go into the Sydney Stadium for exclusive scenes of the Beatles performance.
Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today it's all about the Sydney Stadium, affectionately known as the Old Tin Shed. Bob Hope called it Texas with a tin roof. Bob Dylan nearly passed out in it, and The Who swore on stage, causing a political kerfuffle. Johnny O'Keefe first wooed teenagers there in the late 50s, and of course the Beatles played to hysterical fans in 1964 at the stadium. Now, it was known as the Old Tin Shed, and it could seat up to about 12,000 people. It might have been hot, it might have been sweaty, but it was, most importantly, Sydney's premier venue for decades. So here I am at Rushcutters Bay on our way to find the former location of Sydney Stadium. Apparently it was on the corner of Neild Avenue and New Southhead Road, so that's just down here. And they built the new Cross City Tunnel and the Eastern Suburbs Railway. So this is definitely the vicinity. I believe it's around this area. So there's the Paddington Cross City Tunnel. So we're on our way now to hopefully try and find the plaque that commemorates Sydney Stadium. Yeah, it'll be over, yeah, I think that's the plaque. I think the plaque's over there somewhere. Trying to zoom in and it just, yeah, it's way too far.
Could it be the monument to arguably the most significant site in Sydney's sporting, cultural and musical history? Well, this appears to be it.
I wanted to show you this book. It's called The Old Tin Shed and it's by Terry Smith, 1908 to 1970. Sydney Stadium. It's got some really great photos. It does sort of focus a lot on the boxing period. This one is Vic Patrick versus Tommy Burns, but there's lots of other really good ones. There's one of Les Darcy. I did want to sort of mention that Terry did spend a lot of time at the stadium and has some fantastic memories. So this is a really good book to check out, you know, if you're interested. So, in the beginning, the stadium began as like a temporary boxing ring, and it was about 1908 on Rushcutters Bay Road. The promoter was a guy called Hugh McIntosh, and he initially just built it mainly for boxing matches. How to describe the stadium? It was corrugated iron and timber, it was open air, mostly boxing and wrestling matches were staged there every night. Roller derby arrived in Australia in 1955. Now, some people have described roller derby as stock car racing played with humans. The promoter, Lee Gordon, he actually did organise a week of these bouts that featured about 28 American skaters. Now, sadly, at the time, Lee Gordon did lose money the first time he brought it out, but it might have been ahead of its time because apparently it did return to Australia with more success in the 60s. Lee Gordon. Now, Lee Gordon arrived in Sydney in about 1953. He was an ambitious, dedicated, committed, and a fascinating bloke. So what he did, he came to Australia, he wanted to put on these shows and needed a place, so he hired the Old Tin Shed for about $1,000 a night and put on his first big show there. And they were called like big show concerts, which were just, huge star-studded events, and they had a lot of American big names as the headliners, and they did have Australian acts supporting. So people like Little Richard, the Everly Brothers, Bill Haley, and apparently Johnny Ray, he set a record at the stadium by filling it 27 times. Now, I believe Lee Gordon did also part own the Whiskey A Go-Go in Sydney, as well as Lay Girls, and he also sort of brought out other, cultural sort of forms in Sydney at the time. So, yeah, he was a man ahead of his time, I think. Now, he was a man who made his fortune, he lost them, he recouped them, only to lose everything again. And reportedly Abbott and Costello ran at a loss, as did that initial roller derby. And in fact, surprisingly, the jazz festival with Sarah Vaughan and Dizzy Gillespie also ran at a loss. And Lenny Bruce, apparently that was a bit of a failure. Now, Frank Sinatra, he apparently performed 4 shows for nothing for his mate Lee Gordon when he heard that he was almost penniless. Now, even though Lee Gordon's shows were dominant in Australia for a while, he did secure these top artists. He didn't really have the field to himself for long because a man called Ken Brodziak, he came along and he, was in competition with Lee and promoted some other musical tours. In fact, in 1964, he scored the biggest coup of his career when the Beatles put on their first and only Australian tour. The Beatles. Wow. Fancy being at a Beatles concert in Sydney in 1964. If you were, please leave your comments and let me know how it was. So it was between the 18th and the 20th of June 1964. They played 6 shows at the stadium. Apparently it was over 3 days. And I believe the band was subjected to a storm of jelly babies that were thrown by fans. And this was in response to something that George Harrison had said. Look, the Sydney Morning Herald, they, had glowing reviews about the show. They wrote, "None of us who packed into the stadium for the first Sydney concert will ever forget it. Onto the revolving stage trotted the Beatles through a phalanx of uniformed police and security men. It was absolute bedlam. The first 4 words sung were, 'She was just 17. Close your eyes like I could see tomorrow. Another Sydney Morning Herald report also, again, glowingly sort of spoke about the performance. They said that, the Beatles showed themselves to be every bit as polished, as exciting and engaging in person as they were on their records. So from all account, yeah, the Beatles was a success. And look, there was an interesting story where they were originally signed for a handful of stadiums, and the promoter, Brodziak, he'd actually booked the Beatles before that Beatlemania sort of phenomena was this worldwide thing. And I think it was a verbal contract, and Brian Epstein was the manager. And I think he sort of honoured that particular contract. And yeah, I think it was an actual really great, bargain. It was a steal. So well done. What a fabulous memory for many Australians who were lucky enough to attend. I would have just absolutely enjoyed seeing a band like the Beatles in Sydney. What a wonderful memory that would have been.
And right behind me, you've got Sydney Grammar School, the Weagle Sports Ground. So there is a plaque situated on that oval, and it's a plaque that commemorates Sydney Stadium, the location from 1908 to 1970, and it was just placed there by the Lord Mayor of Wallara as a tribute to the wonderful Sydney Stadium.
We're going to unveil the plaque.
There we go. Yay!
Many famous performers did come to Australia and played at the Sydney Stadium. That was when Lee Gordon brought out his first big show with Ella Fitzgerald, Buddy Rich, Artie Shaw and Jerry Colonna. As well that year they brought out Louis Armstrong, the Andrews Sisters and Johnny Ray. In 1955 Frank Sinatra came out, as well Frankie Lane, Nat King Cole, and it was the year that Abbott and Costello came, as well as Bob Hope. 1957, there was another big show, and this time they had Little Richard there, Gene Vincent, Eddie Cochran, as well, Johnny Ray again, and a fabulous Bill Haley and his Comets came to Australia that year. 1958, we saw Paul Anka, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly and the Crickets, and I believe Johnny O'Keefe and Johnny Devlin were supporting the Australian supporting acts for that tour. 1959, Chuck Berry was here. There's a fabulous picture of Chuck Berry with Johnny O'Keefe, Bobby Darin, Johnny Cash, Cole Joy and the Joy Boys, the Deltones, Johnny Devlin. So it's really pleasing to see a lot of these Australian acts on the bills. 1959, we saw Tommy Sands, the Platters, Frankie Avalon was here, Sammy Davis Jr. and Jerry Lee Lewis. I would have loved to have been at that one. 1960, there was another big super show, and I believe Johnny O'Keefe compared that one with Jerry Lee Lewis. Also the Everly Brothers, Johnny Reb and the Rebels played, Bobby Rydell. So lots and lots of bands. They're coming through thick and fast. 1960, Ricky Nelson was here, Cole Joy and JOK and Johnny Devlin again supporting various sort of, places. There was that big jazz festival with Sarah Vaughan and Dizzy Gillespie that year. 1961, Sammy Davis Jr. played, Cliff Richard also was here, Frank Sinatra, and Shirley Bassey made it to Australia that year. In 1964, the Beach Boys came with Roy Orbison, the Safaris, and Paul and Paula. I believe little Patty apparently also played as a very young 16-year-old because I think she had some hits at the time. 1964 was a big year. Judy Garland and the Beatles. Fantastic. As well, there was a big Liverpool Sound tour, and that had Jerry and the Pacemakers, Dusty Springfield, Gene Pitney and Brian Poole. In 1965, Manfred Mann came, the Kinks. As well, I note that Cilla Black performed at the stadium that year. PJ Proby, he toured, and the Easybeats played as well. Dinah Lee, the Dave Clark Five, the Seekers, Ray Brown and the Whispers, the Kinks, Jimmy Hannon, the Australian Jimmy Hannon. In 1966, the Seekers were at the stadium. Mark Winter, Bob Dylan, the Bee Gees, Marty Roan. And in 1967, Roy Orbison. he was supported by the loved ones. So I'm just loving that they're using a lot of Australian acts as supports. So in 65, Peter, Paul, Mary came, the Monkees were here, Ray Charles, and my favourite one that I noticed, aside from the Beatles tour, in 1968, The Who were here with the Small Faces, and Paul Jones with support Billy Thorpe and the Questions. So yeah, just fantastic. In 1969, I noticed an Italian performer, Claudio Villa, so he was very popular with the Italians. And in 1970, Duke Ellington performed, Sammy Davis Jr., the Beach Boys, and the last act was the Four Tops, who was supported by Flying Circus and Doug Parkinson. So look, that's sort of some of the performers. I wasn't able to name all of them. I'd be here forever. The final concert, as I said, was by the Four Tops, and yeah, apparently the stadium was demolished in 1973, and it did make way for that sort of overhead section of the Eastern Suburbs Railway, and it is now marked by this, you know, commemorative plaque. So that's sort of a small, you know, history or account of the bands that did perform at the Old Tin Shed. David Lillicott, he was front row at one of the shows in 1968, the big show featuring The Who and the Small Faces.
The greatest big show since the Beatles and the Stones, plus the fabulous Small Faces. Sydney Stadium, Monday and Tuesday, 22nd, 23rd of January. Two shows night bookings on 211-0199.
Now, David loved it, and he was front row, and he also got to chat with them, I believe. But there were other people, even Annie Simmons, she actually thought that the performance was kind of subpar, and that's mostly because the sound PA was awful, and apparently Steve Marriott had a hissy fit and smashed his amp. So, and apparently he wrecked the piano, which belonged to the stadium. Ron Clayton, he was actually at the Beatles concert. He was only 13 years old, and he said it was a matinee performance on a Saturday afternoon, and he still got the program. How fantastic is that? Little Richard, he had a concert there, and a fan actually recalls that he had all these pajamas. He stood on his piano and he played, he threw the PJs into the crowd, and then he sort of appeared later in a gold and silver lame outfit. Yeah, just kind of, you know, really crazy stuff. Now, apparently after that concert, he travelled to Newcastle on a ferry, and there's a story that he tells himself where he had a vision and he wanted to give up rock and roll, and he threw all his expensive jewellery into the water.
I got it! I got it! I'm being we just found some jewelry!
And afterwards, I think he became a preacher. Now, there is an audio or an article where John Laws actually vouches that this happened because he was in fact on the ferry, and they were going to some show in Stockton in Newcastle. So yeah, that was rather interesting. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed this vlog. Be sure to like and subscribe, as I am, you know, focused on just continuing this series of Where Are They Now? This one was really special. I just really enjoyed it because of that whole nostalgia, you know, the Beatles performing in Sydney. And yeah, it was a really interesting trip trying to find the venue. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it. Cheers.
Oh, the gorgeous Diggity. Hey, look. Hello. Ah, can you smell Spiky, boy? Can you smell Spiky? No, I've got a mini Foxy. Oh, look. And Robbie's got a Jack Russell / Beagle.